Before we talk about ancient temples or comic panels or anime arcs, I want to start with an image. Superman, floating above the earth. Not angry, not triumphant, just present. Powerful enough to change the course of humanity. Powerful enough to rule. And yet, the thing that makes Superman Superman is not strength. It's restraint. Now hold that thought, because thousands of years earlier, another figure holds power in the sky. Zeus, lightning in his hand, the authority to punish, to bless, to decide fate. And if you zoom out far enough, these two images sit on the same psychological line. Then we jump again. Anime heroes pushing their bodies past the breaking point, Goku collapsing after training, Naruto enduring rejection for years. Characters who don't just gain power, they pay for it. And then we jump again. In a museum, you see an image of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, weighing a human heart on a scale, a story about morality, consequence, and what happens after death. At first glance, these worlds feel unrelated. But today, we're going to be investigating a claim that sounds kind of strange until you follow it all the way through. We never stopped creating gods. We changed how we relate to power. And that shift tells us something profound about the human mind. Before we begin, I want to set the tone clearly here. This episode is not an argument against religion, faith, or belief. Religion has shaped human morality, culture, law, art, and community for thousands of years. For many people, faith is not symbolic, it's lived, practiced, and deeply meaningful. What follows is not theology. It's an investigation into storytelling, psychology, and a human need to understand fear, meaning, responsibility, and hope. We're not asking what is true. We're asking why humans keep telling similar stories across cultures and centuries, even as the symbols change. If you're listening with belief, curiosity, skepticism, or reflection, you belong here. This is not a debate. It's just a journey of thought. Let me ask you something. Across history, across cultures that never met, across languages that never shared words, why do humans keep creating beings greater than themselves? Why do we always imagine figures who can see more than we do, know more than we do, can do what we cannot? From ancient gods to demigods to prophets to saints to superheroes to anime protagonists, and now even to artificial intelligence. This isn't a coincidence, it's a psychological pattern. And today I want to follow it carefully, step by step, kind of like an investigator. Not to prove a point, but just to discover what these stories reveal about us. Take a second. Think about the first hero you ever loved. Not the coolest one, the one you needed. Here is the guiding question for this episode. If gods once stood at the center of human meaning, why do fictional heroes now occupy so much of our imagination? Not as objects of worship, but as objects of fascination. Because gods did not vanish suddenly. What changed was how humans related to power, and storytelling evolved to match that change. So to keep this structured, we're going to walk through 5 stages. 1, gods as explanations for chaos. 2, the moral stories as guidance for how to live. 3, demigods and the birth of relatable power. 4, superheroes as ethical simulations in modern life. And 5, anime as a study of suffering, identity, and the cost of strength. And along the way, I'm going to give you examples for every claim, not just opinions. So this feels more like a real trail you can follow. Now, imagine being a human 10,000 years ago. No modern medicine, no weather forecast, no reliable food supply. A storm isn't just rain, it's a threat. A disease isn't just, bacteria. It's a mysterious force that takes people without asking permission. The human brain isn't built to accept randomness easily. I don't think anyway. Psychologically, we are pattern-seeking creatures. You've heard this before. We detect agency even when none exists. Because evolutionarily, it's safer to assume the rustle in the bushes is something. That tendency to search for intention is one reason gods emerge everywhere. So ancient civilizations created intentional explanations. Thunder became Zeus. The sea becomes Poseidon. Even the sun becomes Ra, and death becomes Anubis. And these gods behave like the forces they represent. For example, Zeus, right? Zeus is not calm. He's jealous, impulsive, and even violent. In myth, his lightning is judgment and authority. When he punishes Prometheus for giving fire to humanity, chaining him so an eagle eats his liver each day, the message is clear. Power is not to be stolen. Knowledge comes with consequences. We've got another example in Poseidon. In Homer's Odyssey, Poseidon turns a sea into a personal grudge. Odyssey binds the Cyclops Polyphemus, Poseidon's son, and the ocean itself becomes an enemy for years. Not because the sea is evil, because the sea is unpredictable, and Poseidon is that unpredictability made into a character. And then you have Ra. In Egyptian myth, Ra journeys across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, and he's battling chaos, often personified as the serpent Apophis. This isn't just a cool story, it's a nightly promise. Order can return even after darkness. These myths were not entertainment first, they were frameworks of surviving reality. Think about that. If the world felt dangerous and unexplainable, wouldn't you want a story that makes it legible? So here's something critical. Ancient gods do not grow. They don't self-reflect. They don't apologize. You don't relate to Zeus. You fear him. That mirrors how ancient societies experience power. Look at kings. They ruled by divine right. Law came from above. Nature came from above. Fate came from above. So gods ruled from above. That's why many ancient myths are not about becoming better people. They're about understanding boundaries. Don't disrespect the gods. Don't cross the natural order. Don't pretend you can control what you cannot. If we look at Icarus flies too close to the sun. He doesn't fall because he's evil. He falls because he's ignoring limits. Now, if you're religious, you might notice something here that exists in many faith traditions too. Religious texts often explore the gap between human limitation and divine authority. If you look at the book of Job, Job suffers despite being righteous. The story confronts a terrifying reality. Life is not always fair, and understanding may not be given. In other words, sometimes the story is not, here's the answer. Sometimes it's, here's how humans endure the absence of answers. And then something changed. We reached the first major turning point now, where humans start to tell stories about figures who are powerful, but not untouchable. This is where demigods come into it. So you got demigods like Hercules, Achilles, Gilgamesh. These are characters, and they act as bridges, right? They are the first time power becomes relatable. And for every claim here, I'm going to show you a story of evidence. So if we look at Gilgamesh, he begins as a king with near divine power, but he's also arrogant. Then his friend Enkidu dies, and the strongest man in the world discovers the strongest enemy, grief. Gilgamesh goes on a desperate search for immortality, and he fails, and the story lands on a brutal human truth. You can be powerful and still be mortal. Going to Achilles, he's almost invincible, but his emotional life is fragile. In the Iliad, his rage is catastrophic. He withdraws from battle, which leads to loss. Patroclus dies Achilles returns not as a hero seeking glory, but as a man possessed by grief. His vulnerability isn't just the heel, it's the human heart. And we go to Hercules. He's strong enough to move mountains, but his story isn't about strength, it's about consequences. In many versions, he's driven mad and kills his family, and the labors become penance. A god strength body, a human fragile mind. This is the psychological shift. Power is no longer a distant force in the sky. Power is now inside a being that can suffer. And once that happens, the stories become about inner life. Now we fast forward quite a while and we come into more of a modern time. Industrialization, world wars, nuclear weapons, mass surveillance. For the first time, humans can do what the gods used to do in the stories. We could erase cities. We can reshape nature and decide life and death at scale. And the central question of storytelling changes with this. It's not, why does the world hurt us? But it's, what should someone do if they have the power to change everything? And this is where superheroes become inevitable. Because superheroes are not just power fantasies, they're moral experiments. Let's talk about the first modern superheroes as cultural symptoms. So Superman, he appears in the late 1930s, a time when the world feels unstable and threatening. And Superman is a being of incredible power, but the stories position him as a protector. He's not a tyrant, and that matters. Because Superman's main conflict is not, can he win? It's, how does he stay good? An example would be Superman as restraint. Over and over, Superman refuses to rule. In many versions, he could impose order if he wanted to. But the moral identity of Superman is that he chooses the burden of restraint. Now, Batman emerges as a modern answer to a different psychological need. Batman says, what if the world is not saved by godlike power? What if it's saved by discipline, preparation, will? You see, Batman's no-killing rule is an ethical boundary, and the intention of that rule, especially in stories like The Dark Knight, is the point. If you cross that line, what happens to you? What happens to justice? And then Spider-Man. Spider-Man is maybe the most psychologically honest superhero because Spider-Man is not defined by his strength. He is defined by guilt. You go to Uncle Ben. I mean, we've seen Uncle Ben die 1,000 times in the movies, but Peter lets a criminal go. Uncle Ben dies. And that single event becomes a lifelong moral compass. And you know the phrase, you can say it with me, with great power comes great responsibility. And that line basically is an updated version of the ancient moral lesson. Power is not neutral. It demands ethics. Now, let me make this fun for a second, because this is where these ideas stop becoming academic and start being real. Captain America versus Iron Man. If you've watched Captain America Civil War in the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you remember the core dilemma. You know, on one side, accountability, oversight, regulation, and then on the other side, personal consequence, individual responsibility. And I remember generally siding with Cap, not because Cap is perfect, but because Cap represents something I want to believe is possible, you know, a person who tries to do the right thing, even when it costs him everything. And I argue about this with my friends, real arguments. Some people say Tony's realistic, Tony's flawed, Tony makes mistakes like we do, and I get it, I really do. But here's what I noticed. The debate wasn't really about who would win a fight, it's about moral identity. Who do you trust with power? A flawed genius who evolves through failure, or a principled soldier who refuses to compromise his core? And I think that argument is ancient. That is a human question wearing superhero clothes. Who did you side with? What does that say about the type of person you are, or the type of person you hope power would make you? Think about it for a while. Let's go deeper. Why do some people love Superman and Captain America, and then others would roll their eyes at these heroes or these specific heroes? Psychologically, it often comes down to this. Some people want heroes to be aspirational, others want heroes to be relatable. Aspirational heroes are moral North Stars. They answer, how should I act? That's Superman, that's Captain America. Captain America's choice. Is constantly sacrificing personal desire for principle. He throws himself on a grenade in training even before he has powers. The point is, goodness is not an outcome, it's a character. But relatable heroes are mirrors. They answer, is it okay that I'm flawed? That's Iron Man, that's Batman, that's Wolverine, people that tend to like those types of characters. Tony's arc is guilt turning into responsibility. He creates weapons, he faces the consequences, and he tries to become better. Wolverine is rage, is trauma, violence, and the slow, painful attempt to be human despite of all of that. These aren't just character preferences, they are psychological needs. And I think sometimes we need a North Star, and sometimes we need a mirror. Anime is where modern mythology becomes brutally honest, because anime doesn't just say power has responsibility, anime says power has a price. If we look at Dragon Ball Z and the body, Goku doesn't level up with speech. He trains until he collapses. He dies, he comes back. His body becomes a receipt for his ambition. You look at Naruto, and his belonging. He doesn't want strength. He wants to be seen. He's rejected as a child, treated as a threat, and he becomes powerful. But a psychological arc is belonging turning into purpose. And then we can even look at Attack on Titan as a justification. Eren Yeager, the main character, he isn't just a simple hero. He becomes a moral fracture. The story asks, what if someone believes they're saving their people and becomes monstrous in the process? So anime pushes us into a kind of a moral gray area. It forces a question ancient gods rarely ask. What does power do to identity? So let's return to the gods for a second. When we compare gods and heroes, we have to be careful. God stories and hero stories are not doing identical jobs. The ancient gods, for example, often answer why the world is the way it is, why nature is dangerous, and why boundaries exist. Whereas the modern heroes would often answer, what should I do with power? How do I stay good? What do I owe others? But there are some overlaps, and the overlaps are where the psychology gets fascinating. So here's an example, Anubis and moral judgment. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Anubis weighs the heart of the deceased against the feather of Mahat. Truth, balance, order. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, it is devoured. That is a moral system, and it's also a psychological one. It says your inner life matters, not just your survival. Now compare that to hero moral judgment. If we look at Spider-Man's guilt, Peter Parker's heart is heavy, not with evil, but with responsibility. The story isn't about punishment by a god, it's about self-judgment. That's the key shift. Ancient moral systems often externalize judgment. Modern hero stories often internalize it. Here is one of the biggest evolutions. Ancient societies often approach power through worship, ritual, and obedience, and modern societies increasingly approach power through debate, criticism, and ethics. That's why we don't worship superheroes, we analyze them, we argue about them. We ask, was Batman right? Should Superman intervene? Did Tony deserve forgiveness? This is storytelling as moral laboratories. And it reflects something modern humans do constantly. We don't just want meaning, we want justification, we want reasons, we want accountability. And that's why superhero stories thrive in a world shaped by law, democracy, systems, and technology. And speaking of technology, let's talk about AI, artificial intelligence. Scary. Algorithms, systems too complex for any single person to fully understand. This is the return of the ancient feeling. Sometimes something powerful exists, it shapes our lives, we don't fully control it. That feeling is older than science, and in ancient times that feeling becomes gods. In modern times that feeling becomes systems. And now we are building the systems ourselves that create a new moral tension. Because when we created gods and myth, they were outside of us. When we create AI, it is inside our civilization. So the question becomes, who's responsible for power we created that acts beyond us? Superhero stories have been rehearsing that question for decades. They practice for a future where humans are not the most powerful thing in the room. You know, as a father of two boys, this isn't just interesting, it's practical. Because I'm not only asking what the world is, I'm asking what kind of men my sons will become inside of it. And stories matter because these stories are our training. When my kids see Superman choose restraint, they're learning something. When they see Captain America stand for principle, they are learning something. When they see Batman struggle with darkness and still choose a line not to cross, they learn something. And when they see anime heroes enduring suffering, they learn something too, that growth costs, the effort matters, and becoming is painful. If you're a parent, think about the heroes your kids love. What values are hidden inside those stories? And if you're not a parent, think about the heroes you loved. What were you learning without even realizing it? So let's land this investigation. Gods did not disappear. What changed was the human relationship to power. In a world where nature felt uncontrollable, we created gods to give chaos a face. In a world where humans became dangerously powerful, we created heroes to ask, what should power do? Over time, moral judgment moved from external authority to internal consequence. Worship shifted from obedience to reflection. And now, in the age of systems and AI, the oldest question has returned. What happens when something stronger than us shapes the world? The difference is this time, we might be the creators. So the conclusion is not cynical, it's a challenge. If our stories evolved from gods to heroes, maybe it means we matured from fear towards responsibility. Maybe we stopped asking who controls the universe and started asking, what kind of people should we be inside of it? Well, there it is. Thanks for listening, guys. This is Between Worlds and I'm Alex. If this episode made you think, follow and subscribe on our various podcast platforms and join me on my various social media links in the description. On the next episode, does anime understand suffering the best? I'm Alex. Until next time, stay curious and I'll meet you between worlds.